This is Wayweyonda Creek, a 17-mile-long body of water that runs right through the village of Warwick, flowing southwest into New Jersey. And this is the village's wastewater treatment plant from 1963, which discharges 1 million gallons per day of effluent, or treated wastewater, back into Wayweyonda Creek. As you may have heard, the village is undertaking one of the most significant infrastructure upgrades in the past 30 years, a $12 million overhaul of the wastewater treatment plant. It's currently in the design phase. Construction is expected to start in 2023, and it should be operational in 2024. As with any major capital improvement project, I had a lot of questions, such as, how does the current system work and what's wrong with it? If it does need to be replaced, what are the alternatives? And what was the basis for choosing the design that was ultimately selected? And importantly, who's paying for all of this? As part of my own due diligence, I've studied our current system in detail from a 2018 engineering report. I've gone through the relevant New York State regulations. I've learned as much as I could about the design of the new treatment plant and the funding strategy. This is the process I go through to familiarize myself with important village-related matters. And in this video, I'll share with you what I learned and what to expect over the next few years. This is something that affects every resident, and public health should always be a priority. In 1965, the federal government passed the Water Quality Act and required states to start issuing water quality standards. In 1972, the Federal Clean Water Act started regulating discharges of pollutants into bodies of water. And over the decades, regulation would become more well-defined and more comprehensive. As you can imagine, New York State had something to say about this too. The Environmental Conservation Law established the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation. Recognizing that our state is rich in groundwater and surface water resources, the DEC created the State Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, SPDES, to protect these valuable resources. It was designed to eliminate water pollution and maintain the highest quality of water possible. And it works like this. Anyone, whether it's a municipality, a business, even a construction site, discharges pollutants into New York State waters, they have to get a permit. When rain falls, if it becomes polluted on your property, say it flows through sawdust or debris and then into a creek, it is your responsibility to keep the pollutants to a minimum. Oftentimes, in addition to obtaining a permit, you may be required to submit a stormwater pollution prevention plan, or SWIP, saying that you are following best practices to ensure that runoff is as clean and unpolluted as possible. So take our village's wastewater treatment plant. As I mentioned before, it is discharging 1 million gallons per day of effluent into Wayweyonda Creek. And you better believe that the village is going to need a permit to do this. Unfortunately, with our current infrastructure, the village has not been able to consistently meet the requirements of the SPDES, again, that State Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. In fact, from 2014 to 2018, it exceeded reasonable limits 36 different times. One of the reasons for this is that the requirements to obtain a permit have become more and more strict over the years, to the point of the design of our existing system can't even meet the current limits. So on one hand, yes, we have to deal with a deteriorating infrastructure. But on the other hand, the state has forced our hand by modifying those permit requirements so much that we cannot consistently meet the guidelines moving forward unless we take drastic action. So in that sense, we have to do the upgrade based on regulations alone. Now, when researching this, I was trying to get the gist of what the strict regulations entail. And there are 3 primary requirements of any wastewater treatment plant discharging effluent into a body of water. The first one is nitrification of ammonia. Second one is tertiary treatment. And third is effluent disinfection. Let's briefly step through each of these. The nitrification of ammonia. So untreated wastewater contains ammonia. Ammonia is a nutrient that reacts with bacteria to make proteins that break down organic waste. It is critical to the wastewater treatment process. So in a sense, that's really good. But it's also toxic to many fish, so it needs to be controlled prior to being discharged into the environment. Nitrification is the biological process where bacteria converts that ammonia to nitrite, and the nitrite's converted to nitrate. And this whole process removes ammonia, makes it safe for discharge. The second requirement is tertiary treatment. Tertiary meaning third. It comes after the primary and secondary treatments, which do most of the work in preparing that wastewater for discharge. It's this third step that purifies the water even more, potentially to the point of being safe for consumption or reuse. And that's a main requirement. The third requirement is effluent disinfection. Remember, effluent is the outflowing of treated wastewater into a natural body of water. Disinfection is that final step to remove potentially harmful microorganisms from treated water before the effluent is released back. It prevents the spread of waterborne diseases. Okay, so those are the three main requirements that all treatment plants must contemplate in their design. And that's why these are such complex and expensive systems. Regulations aside, let's take a step back and take a look at the current state of our treatment plant, because my first question was, why do we need to do this? And why do we need to spend $12 million? So the current plant was originally constructed in 1963 with two major upgrades, 1972 and again in 1992. A few minor upgrades since until 2018, at which point the Orchard Street pump station, where all wastewater flows into before reaching the plant, that pump station was completely overhauled. And then the plant itself, there's an ultraviolet UV treatment tank that was installed in 2019. And that 2019 upgrade was a result of another modification to the state permitting process. So we have a mix of old and new. Now, what are the components of the infrastructure? How does the current plant actually work, and what shape is it in? Let's start by looking at how it gets from your home to the plant. So with the flow of sewage, gravity plays an important role. Throughout the village, your house's sewer line ties in at the road. By the way, this is my front yard. This January, when my sewer line collapsed and my front yard had to be entirely excavated for the pipe to be replaced. Moving on. When the sewage reaches the street, it makes its way through a series of sewer lines until it reaches a pump station. Now, we have 5 sewage pump stations in the village, 2 in Warwick Grove, 1 in Homestead Village, 1 on Orchard, as we talked about, and 1 on Robin Bray. Now, when the wastewater arrives at the pump station, it's collected inside a wet well. And then there are sensors that measure the depth of the water. And once it reaches a certain depth, the mechanical pumps turn on and start pumping wastewater uphill and tie into the main sewer line. At which point, gravity then carries the load to that Orchard Street pump station as its final stop before entering the treatment plant. Remember, the goal is to make it safe to put back into the environment. So the first component in the works is called the headworks, or that initial stage of this complex process. And its whole purpose is to screen out inorganic waste like plastics and trash, not even letting it enter the treatment plant. So in the current system, the headworks was found to be insufficient in screening debris. And as you can imagine, the technology to screen out debris has improved over the decades. Now, to better protect downstream processes and reduce that maintenance cost, the village upgraded the Orchard Street pump station with a mechanical screening system as opposed to manual. Since all of the wastewater passes through the Orchard Street pump station, this was a natural point to remove that large debris and protect the other equipment downstream. This work was completed in 2019 and will continue to serve that function even after the new treatment plant is constructed. The second phase is the primary clarifier, which are just 3 large tanks, 2 of them from 1972, the third from 1992. Unfortunately, the specifications of these don't meet current DEC standards, and the majority of the components are deteriorating, including the original concrete tanks, flow control valves, hardware throughout. The engineering report recommended replacing all of these components and installing floating baffles to direct the flow of water, especially during peak capacity, as that will improve the treatment process downstream. Now, the next phase, wastewater flows through the rotating biological contractors, or RBCs. The purpose of the RBCs is to remove all that grit, sand, and other smaller debris, and it is the primary biological treatment step in the process. So these RBCs were installed in 1992, and at the time, they were state-of-the-art. The RBCs replaced an older trickling filter system, and this upgrade resulted in 8 to 10 times higher levels of treatment. So it was a big deal at the time. And here we are, 30 years later, past the expected useful life of these RBCs. And the system is, unsurprisingly, deteriorating. There are 15 units. All of them have moving parts like rotating shafts and bearings that are failing, as well as gearboxes that require frequent and costly repairs. There are also snail problems. Yes, snails that gum up the works seasonally. And the recommendation from the report was to replace this entire section either with new RBCs or another emerging technology. More on that later. The next phase, the secondary clarifiers, the job here is to treat the wastewater even further into the 4 tanks that we have. However, similar to the primary, these are from 1972 and no longer meet the DEC specs, and they are deteriorating as well. Now, when solids are removed from the secondary clarifier, they go through a digesting process, which operates 2 to 3 times a week and fills one 40-yard roll-off dumpster per week that goes to the landfill. And this part was actually upgraded in 2016. The only challenge there is the physical structure housing that equipment. Next are those tertiary filters. Remember, we talked about one of the main requirements of the DEC permitting process, tertiary. Basically, a third level of treatment that uses sand filters. So wastewater slowly pumped in, and then gravity carries it down through a layer of sand that contains harmless microorganisms. And this naturally filters and cleans that water. That's right, water flows through dirt to become clean. It took me a minute to wrap my head around that. Now, we have 2 of these units which were installed in 1992 that were also housed in a masonry block building, and these units are at the end of their expected useful life. In fact, this is the number one point of failure in the entire infrastructure. Most of the call-in alarms the village receives happens when these mechanical components in this step malfunction and the whole system backs up. Then there's the matter of that physical building, which is also falling apart due to high humidity and it's corroding electrical wiring. Moving along in the process, the chlorine tanks. These disinfect the water. Now, historically, adding chlorine has been an effective and reliable method for disinfection, but it does have its limitation. For example, chlorine residuals, which is essentially concentrated bleach, can be toxic to aquatic life, and the long-term effects on the environment are unknown. So in 2018, the village converted this disinfection system to ultraviolet, UV disinfection, in response to another DEC permit modification. And with this new method, UV light enters, it disinfects the water by penetrating microorganisms and destroying their DNA so they can't multiply. And it's one of the most efficient ways to achieve the required treatment levels. So the good news here is that part's complete and it will stay. The final step is discharging this treated water into Waywayanda Creek. Now, I've alluded to some of the various problems, but let's summarize and frame this in the context of a problem statement. Number 1, health and sanitation. The existing plant cannot consistently meet those DEC permit limits that were established to protect human and environmental health. It would need a massive overhaul to meet compliance standards. Number 2, aging infrastructure. The majority of the tanks and equipments are between 30 and 50 years old. This has caused increasing maintenance and repairs, and the costs are adding up. Number 3 is I&I, or inflow and infiltration. Just a quick sidebar, what is that? Inflow happens when stormwater enters the collection system either through a roof drain or an illegal connection at the street. And infiltration is when groundwater or stormwater enters the collection system through cracked pipes. Basically, it's unwelcome water entering the sewer system, and the problem with that is that it could exceed the plant's capacity, which results in a discharge of untreated water back into the environment. Not good. So the village does suspect there are cases of I&I and makes an ongoing effort to identify and fix those problem areas. Number 4 is the expectation of growth. The village is expected to experience reasonable growth over the next 20 years. There are 3 subdivisions planned: Village View, Warwick Meadows, and an apartment complex on Forester Avenue. Additionally, there's that potential for annexation of town land into the village. And this projected growth will put an additional strain on the wastewater treatment plant and therefore the already stressed Waywayanda Creek. Number 5 is suitability for continued use. Much of the current treatment plant has reached the end of its useful life, with components that are between 30 and 50 years old, and many upgrades are needed. The concern with keeping the current plant going is the potential harm to public health and the environment. And number 6 is compliance with accepted standards. Some of the infrastructure does not meet current accepted design standards. mainly in the primary and secondary clarifiers, which have shallow tanks that could result in ineffective treatment of wastewater before being discharged to the environment. So that answers my first question, what's wrong with the current infrastructure? And to definitively answer my second question, is it really necessary? The answer there is a resounding yes, especially as it pertains to public health, environmental protection, and regulatory compliance with the state. Thanks to the leadership of Mayor Newhard and Deputy Mayor Barry Cheney, we have a plan in place and a funding strategy to overhaul the treatment plant. My next question was, if we know we need to upgrade, what are the alternatives and the costs of each? In 2017, the village engaged in a feasibility study to evaluate the existing RBCs and provide recommendations for capital improvements. During the process, several potential alternative treatments and technologies were also identified and assessed. However, since that study, things changed a bit when the wastewater treatment plant had begun to accept backwash or excess water from the fresh water treatment plant at the reservoir off of Brady Road as a requirement of the DEC permitting process. Basically, when filtering fresh drinking water, there will be backwash as a result, and that has to go somewhere. We were required to send it to the treatment plant, which significantly increases the load on the existing plant. So now, not only was it a matter of aging infrastructure and the aging treatment technology, but now we have to think about an expansion in capacity in order to meet the demands of the village over the coming decades. Now, it wouldn't make sense performing capital improvements to the existing RBC-based technology, since that wouldn't solve that increased capacity problem. So for this reason, the village had to look at an entirely new treatment plant that could not only handle the expanded capacity, but would also be built with state-of-the-art technology. 3 viable options that were explored were, number 1, upgrading the existing RBC in kind, meaning similar technology, but with all newer equipment, still a complete overhaul. Number 2, replacing the RBC with the newer sequence batch reactor, SBR technology, which uses gravity to separate waste. And number 3, replacing the RBC with a membrane bioreactor, MBR, which uses a membrane physical barrier to separate waste. All viable options. The village ultimately decided to go with the engineering firm's recommendation for option number 2, the SBR or sequence batch reactor based treatment technology. And the life cycle costs all appear to be relatively similar. So what was the basis for this decision? From the engineering report, what I could tell is determined that the SBR upgrade with the associated filters and UV improvements was recommended because this system would provide for better storm resiliency, being able to handle periods of high flow, operations flexibility by running 2 cycle basins in parallel, number 3, odor control, number 4, treatment adaptability for potential future limits by the DEC, and number 5, the fact that the operations staff are already familiar with this type of system. Okay, so great. We have a plan. But before we get into the costs and the funding strategy, I wanted to get a better handle on what this SBR technology is and what that new process would look like. Here's what I learned. Similar to before, the Orchard Street pump station will pump all wastewater into the treatment plant at the headworks. As I mentioned earlier, the existing headworks was not doing its job. So it will be replaced with what's called a grit chamber. And after all that is, it's a long, narrow tank that's designed to slow down the flow of water into it so that solids like sand and coffee grounds and eggshells will settle to the bottom and out of the water, because grit causes wear and tear on downstream equipment. So this will be an important first step. The next step is that the wastewater will enter the sequencing batch reactors, those SBRs. In fact, we're going to have 2 of them that we can cycle through for greater flexibility in operations. So what is an SBR? It's a modern advanced technology for wastewater treatment that's replacing the legacy RBCs. It's what's called an activated sludge system, which basically just means that you are adding bacteria and air to the sewage. Okay, so what? So the way it works is it's a reactor with multiple chambers where bacteria, microorganisms, remove the nutrients from the water, and then air, oxygen, is pumped in to create the aerobic conditions for the solids to break down. And then that sludge is removed through the process of just gravity settling. And what this does is it eliminates the need for those primary and secondary clarifiers of the existing system, which to my understanding will just be abandoned in place. And instead, they're going to put a flow equalizer to regulate the flow of water into the downstream phases. And after that, the wastewater will go through a decanter, just like decanting a fine Cabernet. Sludge enters a feed inlet, it's rotated at high speed like a centrifuge, and then treated water exits one side, and the solid sludge exits the other side, which can then be taken to the landfill for disposal. Now, after the decanting, the existing tertiary filters that we talked about before, those filters themselves will be replaced, but kept within the existing physical building to more effectively filter that treated water. Then it goes through the existing ultraviolet disinfection process, the system that was newly replaced and paid for in 2019, that stays. So now, after the disinfection, the clean, treated effluent discharges into Wastewater Creek. So we talked about the need to upgrade. We talked about the technology and process of the new design, but what about the cost and the village's strategy for funding? Per the engineering report, the probable cost is $12 million. From the number you see here, it was downward adjusted slightly because the Orchard Street pump station was already upgraded and paid for. So let's call it $12 million. And a few years ago, the village board smartly anticipated this expense. Since that 2% tax cap was introduced in 2012, it was only pierced once in the village, and that was for creating a sewer land tax that all of us pay annually. You can see it here in the adopted budget sent to the state every year. This brings in roughly $900,000 per year specifically to fund the new sewage treatment plant. So for the past 3+ years, the village has accrued nearly $3 million in reserves. So in addition to this $3 million in reserves, because of that sewer land tax, the village also applied for and received commitment for $3 million in grant money with the Environmental Facilities Corp, EFC. And that brings us to $6 million out of the $12 million total. That leaves $6 million remaining. So if you look at the current adopted budget, there's a line item for BAN, B-A-N, or Bond Anticipation Note for $2 million. This was good thinking by the current board because what it allows us to do is to borrow $2 million at 0% interest. It's going to pay for all the engineering and design work leading up to when the project actually starts. Then, when that project starts, that $2 million BAN or Bond Anticipation Note will convert into an actual bond, along with the remaining $4 million to fully fund it. So that's the $12 million. Then we're going to see that debt service as a line item for every budget for the next 12 years while we pay it off. And the good news is that sewer land tax of $900,000 per year will be enough to cover the debt service. In other words, I expect no additional tax to the residents during this time for the treatment plant. As far as the timeline, my understanding is the design will be completed this year, 2022. The construction will happen throughout 2023, and the treatment plant should be operational in 2024. This represents the largest infrastructure upgrade in the village in 30 years. It is a testament, I think, to the strong leadership of Mayor Newhard and Deputy Mayor Cheney. I thank them for the tremendous amount of work that's gone into the planning process. And for me, it's comforting to know that we are in position to consistently meet the exacting standards of the state and to do our part in keeping our waters clean.